Today I'm joined by Hayden. He was a lawyer, started his own law firm, funded and managed Pewgin. You were also working in sales for Apple, and you're also a paramedic. So you have a very vast background, which is very interesting. Can you just get us started by how was the process from doing so many different things until where you are now at Canonical?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Fabio. It's really great to be here. I've had a lot of interesting jobs, and this actually used to bother me. How about every 5 years, like I would get bored and go do something next. But once I kind of embraced it as part of my personality, um, it's actually worked out really well. So I had a very normal high school experience, went to college, um, undergrad, kind of bounced around in undergrad a little bit, kind of had to find my footing in the world. Took a break from undergrad and went to medic school, um, and worked as a paramedic for a long time. I say a long time for me, which is like 3 or 4 years.
Hey, that's quite long, to be honest. I think it's quite long.
Yeah. And then so from a tech background, I've always been a tinkerer. We're probably going to end up talking about Linux, and I've been using Linux and other Linux-like operating systems kind of as a hobby since I was a teen, but I never really pursued it professionally. Um, Mostly because I thought I needed a computer science degree, and I could never do the math that was required for those degrees, like calculus. I just couldn't do it. So I kind of just wrote that off as something that will just always be a hobby. But I got close a few times. So uh, I worked for Apple for a while, doing business sales, personal shopping. It was fun in the Apple retail environment. And being part of that, especially when Steve was still in charge at Apple, that was really special. Um, but then I decided I had to go to grad school, and I went so my actual undergrad is in anthropology,
Okay.
with focus in archaeology.
All right.
So as part of my undergrad, I was actually out in the field digging, doing field studies. Um, I got to take classes on like identifying, uh, you know, pre-human primates and that kind of thing. It's really fun. Um,
I actually had a friend that did
and
that. Yeah.
yeah. So then I went to law school, and law school was really interesting. I actually really enjoyed law school. Um, I got out of law school at a time when the market for lawyers wasn't that great. Um, I kind of went into law school to avoid the recession, but the recession really didn't catch up to the legal field until I got out. Um, I went to law school in the DC area, and that was around the time that the sequester hit, which you may not, non-U.S. followers may not be familiar with, but it was a time when they dramatically cut back a lot of government. So a lot of entry-level legal jobs just weren't available. So I had to rough it for a while, and we ended up moving from the DC area because the market was just flooded. Um, and I moved back to Georgia, where I went to school and was from, uh, and moved to the city where my wife's family is. And I clerked here until I passed the Maryland bar, and then I had to take the Georgia bar. Once I passed the Georgia bar, it's a small town. It's here in Georgia. We're not in Atlanta, which is the major metro area. So I hung my own shingle, and did some interesting work, mostly business litigation. And I had my own practice. I had a law clerk. I had some paralegals. I had some, Fortune 500 clients that hired me to do work in Georgia. I also just did a lot of local stuff, in a small community like this. When you're a lawyer, you kind of end up being a family lawyer, a business lawyer, a little bit of everything to the community. But I did that for about 5 years, and I kind of felt like I had gone as far as I could with that. And I also found the tone of the legal profession to be changing. Even between the 5 years I started and when I left, it got much more acrimonious, to the point where, you'd have a good case, or you'd have a strong position on a motion, and you'd contact the opposing counsel, and you'd explain your position and the case, and they would recognize where you are, in the case, and you deal, right? You'd work it out. But towards the end, I found that increasingly parties and their attorneys just aren't as reasonable anymore, and you just had to beat them hard in court again and again and again. And maybe I just lost the heart for doing that. But in the meantime, I was looking for a new laptop. Okay. And I'd been in the Apple ecosystem for quite a while, but I didn't like the direction the MacBook Pros were going. Basically, after 2015, it sounded like the keyboards had lots of issues. I wasn't interested in the touch bar, like that didn't appeal to me at all. So I'd seen these people who were fanatical about ThinkPads, Lenovo ThinkPads. So I picked a used one up off eBay, and I put Linux on it, and I liked it. It was pretty good, but I still needed to run a handful of Windows applications for my law job. Expensive applications I paid for, and they kind of worked in wine, but not really. So I installed Windows reluctantly and tried. And I'd known about WSL, and I had tried it in a VM before, Windows Subsystem for Linux. But that's when I really dug in it's probably about 4 years ago now is when I started really tinkering with WSL. Okay. And for those of you who don't know, WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, is a feature of Windows 10 that gives you a lightweight virtual environment to run Linux applications in. Linux is a free and open source operating system that has a lot of commonalities with legacy Unix servers, which power a lot of websites and services on the web. And it's considered a competitor to Windows in some ways, and in some ways it's not.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's funny that this is sort of how you got started with WSL. I've been using my MacBook Pro, which I bought in 2015, early 2015. So I get what you say. That's like the last good ones. I actually had to upgrade my SSD because it was too small and I could do it myself. I didn't have to go anywhere because it was the last version of that you could change the hard drive. And for the whole streaming and for the whole thing with the podcast and editing and all the things I do, I needed something a bit beefier, let's say, than my MacBook Pro. It was struggling already. So I built my own computer, and that was the first time that I built a computer, and I haven't used Windows. So I think it was probably Vista was my last Windows, so that was a long time ago. And I was so surprised with WSL. I didn't expect it to just run Windows permanently. I did say, okay, I'm going to give this a shot, and then I'll probably will do a boot with, I wasn't really sure with the distro, maybe Ubuntu, maybe Mint, I'm not sure. And I haven't yet. And it's been, I think, 2 months, or just coming to 2 months, and yeah, I haven't looked back yet.
That's great. That's great. I discovered WSL, and I started kind of getting involved a little bit in the community, kind of answering questions, helping people out, kind of figuring out who were the movers and shakers. And I started putting together a set of hacks that made WSL just kind of work out of the box, with a lot of things like GUI apps and, just configuring things that made what we would consider sane defaults. I was constantly hacking on this and breaking the configuration because I was pushing it to see what it could do. So I'd have to reset and then rerun the script. And I said, well, why don't I just build my own image of a distro and have all this stuff baked in? Mm-hmm. So I did. And I scripted it, and I started building my own image. And then I showed it around to a few people. At that time, it was called WLinux, and people were really interested in this. And having a Linux distro that was tuned and configured specifically for WSL. And I was like, okay, well, this was during a time, and it hasn't stopped, during discussions about sustainability in open source, and specifically open source development, independent open source development. The people who kind of tirelessly maintain those obscure libraries you may call in your Python application, or, that does that one thing you need to do, but you never really think about the person who's basically free part-time job is maintaining that library so that you can do that. So you don't have to write 300 lines of code to do that one little thing you need to do. You're lucky if it's just 300, right?
That would be easy to. That would be easy to maintain. I'm a maintainer for an open source project, which is a chatbot library written in Python, and we rely on all the other open source packages and libraries, so we can integrate with different chat connectors. And I have a lot of respect by any open source contributor, maintainer, creator, everything. So
so one of my ideas for this was that you charge, and like in some places you can't charge, right? So like how you can't charge for a PyPy package really, but there's other ways you can charge, and then you can take where you can charge and push those resources and funds upstream, So I contacted Microsoft and said, hey, I want to put my own distro in the store. They said, great. And I said, yeah, and I want to charge for it. And they said, let's check with legal. And I knew legal would say it's okay because one of the 4 freedoms of free software is the ability to charge. As long as the source is available and the licenses are respected, it's okay to charge for free software.
And I guess your legal background helped you as well, navigating the whole legal thing.
It did. Tech law wasn't. There's not a lot of tech law in rural Georgia, but where it did come up, I did have some experience there, and like I've spoken at some tech conferences on legal issues. So kind of knew what I was getting into a little bit. And I put it in the store, and it took off. And people, it was controversial because charging for Linux is always controversial.
Yeah.
Unless, let me put it this way: in the enthusiast community, it is. For enterprise, they have no problem paying for Linux. They want to pay for Linux, but charging individual end users is tricky. But it took off, and we started getting lots of feedback and user requests. And what evolved was a model of very user-connected development, where basically by paying $10 for Penguin, which is what we rebranded to, and is Penguin with Pengwin, so a little bit of a fun there because it's on Windows.
Yep.
And the users who paid $10, we basically then considered them like shareholders. Like, you give us $10, and it helps maintain this project. And as part of that, we give you support, in the GitHub issues. We bundle in a handful of tools and, defaults that are optimized for WSL. And we built, we kind of plugged into the WSL community and started building this WSL community. And eventually, I was able to wind down my solo law practice. Excuse me. And I briefly went to work for another law practice, basically on the side.
Okay.
Because I was starting to do work full time on Penguin, and eventually I had to hire other developers to help me. So I had a developer. I hired Patrick in Hong Kong, Carlos, and Kim from the UK, and together we worked on Penguin. And then we started getting enterprise contracts for businesses who wanted custom images of Penguin for their systems, specifically CentOS based distros. Penguin is based on Debian, but then we also did work to help bring Fedora and CentOS as an option to WSL, because those aren't really officially supported by those projects. And then we branched into basically distro maintenance, and we created Raft, which is a GUI that helps you maintain all of your existing WSL distros and install them and reinstall them and reset them and convert between 1 and 2, just like in a really nice native Windows GUI experience. And it was a lot of fun working on an international team, kind of setting our own hours, kind of doing what we wanted. And we didn't go out and get VC funding. I didn't want VC funding. Some of the startup incubators I looked at basically have a no open source policy. They're like, we're not interested if you're open source, at all.
Because they're afraid that someone steals the idea.
Right. Of course, all of the best startups rely on open source.
Yeah.
They just, the VCs don't want to fund open source. So we said we didn't need that. So we kind of I wrote a manifesto called what is an indie open source project? And it's funded by the users. We're directly accountable to our users. We often have a personal relationship with our users. And it was great because then Microsoft released a trailer video for their new Windows terminal at Build 2019, and it had Penguin in it, featured. And it was like, oh, that's great. It's fantastic. And then I got to speak at Build, and things kind of hit a lot of momentum then. And it was around that time that I heard from someone at Canonical, the company that publishes Ubuntu. And basically, they said, hey, we've noticed what you're doing out there. Of course, they have distros that, in WSL as well, but they kind of wanted to take it to the next level. Would I be interested in coming over? And after a series of discussions, we reached an agreement where, I was willing to come over. I made arrangements to ensure continuity of Penguin and Raft, so that those wouldn't just go away. Carlos on the team stepped up to become the new owner, benevolent dictator for life of that, and it's continuing. And then I actually stole Patrick and brought him with me to Canonical. And basically, Canonical gave me more resources to do what I wanted to do. And to back up a little bit, I had been thinking a lot as the inspiration that went into this was I've always been a fan of the terminal. I think the terminal is very powerful, useful. I don't think end users should be afraid of the terminal. I think, ideally you shouldn't have to go to the terminal, but I also want to make the terminal accessible enough where if you land there, it's not hard and you start to kind of unpack what it can do. So I was actually thinking about this back when I was in the Apple ecosystem, something on iOS. I looked at Pythonista and said, that's great for Python, but what if I want Bash? Like, what if I wanted to use Bash to script and automate iOS the way you can in Pythonista? But I ultimately decided that the Apple ecosystem was just too closed. It wasn't clear if my Bash scripts that downloaded libraries if I could put that app in the store because it's downloading other binaries. And ultimately, I experimented with some things on Windows. Like, if you go look at my GitHub repos, there's a proof of concept of like a Minix, which is another Unix clone that's running on Windows. It's like a simplified Bash experience. But WSL was the way to go, ultimately, not only because of the openness of the Microsoft Store, the encouragement from Microsoft, but the platform was just so much more powerful than something we could. It's something we could build on. Like, we didn't need to build the whole stack. We could just put our distro on WSL and go from there. So my mission has always been to bring more people to the terminal, expose more people to open source, help people be more productive. And the key thing to coming over to Canonical and working on Ubuntu on WSL is that it gave me and our team and WSL a platform to continue to promote this as an option. And you self-mentioned you thought about dual booting, but then you ended up going with WSL.
Yeah.
And the question is, does that present a conflict? A little bit. So ideally we would want you on Ubuntu desktop, but we kind of like open source isn't a zero sum equation. You contribute to a project because you know that your contributions flow outwards and other contributions flow back. And what we realized is that people who are using Ubuntu on WSL are actually now more likely to use Ubuntu other places. So they are spinning up Ubuntu VMs in the cloud. They're buying Raspberry Pis and flashing them with Ubuntu. they're buying second machines and having, you know, other machines. You know, I've got I've got 2 devices running Windows and 2 devices running Ubuntu on my desktop. So, and that doesn't include WSL on Windows, where I spend a lot of time. So it's not, even though users are going to WSL and using Linux there, we are broadening the reach of Linux and kind of expanding the fold, and it's really exciting. I think it's really forward thinking of Microsoft to do this, to basically let us on to their platform and let us kind of show everyone, hey, this is what Linux can offer. And I do think occasionally it gets cool enough that people are like, well, let me just install actual Ubuntu, which is great. But that's not exactly what we're trying to do. It's not really a competition. It's bringing people into the ecosystem, teaching them the skills, and then, going from there. That's a long answer to like one question you asked 20 minutes ago.
But through all these things that you said, there's a lot of things that you said, so it's perfectly fine. And it's very interesting that you say that the fact that Windows allowed folks to install Linux distribution will definitely make people more interested and more keen on trying the pure system instead of just using the terminal. Because one of the most powerful things, not one of the most powerful, but maybe the thing that makes people really love their Linux distribution is how much you can customize your distribution. You can make your operating system to look exactly how you want. I know when I was using Ubuntu, and so I used to have a very old laptop before I bought the MacBook, and I was using Ubuntu, was my first Linux distribution that I've tried, and I used to spend hours just changing how the windows look, how the cursor look, the whole theme, what we usually do. So even if people are just wondering what is this Ubuntu thing, I think definitely just have a look at it, install it. You have so many different ways. You can just even use, like you said, Raspberry Pi, which is fairly cheap and is quite powerful, especially this last version. You can even just use a USB stick and get the Ubuntu working there. So yeah, I have a question from Horacio. He asked, what about your previous career that helped you think was so what was about your previous career that helped you, and what do you think it was valuable when you started as an engineer?
Right. So public speaking, kind of project management. So when you're a lawyer, of course, you're going to court, you're arguing cases. So you need to develop those public speaking skills. Project management, you may have a case that takes 6 months. You may have a case that takes 6 years, and there's steps along the way. You have to plan for those. So there's a lot of like management, administrative tasks that have to be required. Supervising other employees, and being accountable for their work. Mm-hmm. So when you're an attorney and you have a paralegal draft something, when you sign it and file it, you're accountable for that. Like, there's no blaming the paralegal for making the mistake. It's your law license. So certainly a sense of accountability for your team was key. And probably some degree of emotional intelligence. And that is being able to work in this situation where, I'm on WSL, I work on WSL, I'm on the desktop team at Ubuntu, but I need to be able to have nuanced conversations about these platforms with developers who may be skeptical, so some persuasion there, and navigate sometimes where there's somewhat of a conflict of interest, and work around those and find common ground, find where there's examples. If someone's working on WSL and issues a patch for your favorite open source, tool, it's still a patch for your open source tool. So helping kind of shape the narrative there, and guide people away from kind of the reflexive anger that some in the Linux community have towards Microsoft, and towards a more constructive, long-term, progressive view of what this means. So certainly that's one way where the kind of the work you do, the emotional work you do with people as a lawyer came in handy as well, in addition to the administrative and project management and public speaking skills.
This is one thing that comes pretty much on every talk that I do with a guest, is that being a developer, it's not just writing code. You're working with a team, so it's important to know how to communicate, how to manage yourself, how to manage your team as well. And I understand completely that all this experience, because in essence, as a lawyer, you are a very good speaker, a very good communicator. So,
right.
Yeah.
And it comes in handy because, like on our team, the engineers in desktop that we work with, and Patrick on our team, they're smarter than I am. I mean, and they're better coders, like no doubt. Like I can put something together, I can code in a handful of languages. It's kind of pigeon scratchy. But like acknowledging that, like their skills exceed mine, but I'm here not to put them down or to lord my skills over them because I don't have them. I'm here to help facilitate what they're doing, and guide, kind of list, serve as an advocate in the community, hear, get feedback from developers and users, serve as like a conduit between our organization and Microsoft and the teams who work on WSL at Microsoft. So I really see myself as a facilitator, and that's kind of where it really links back to my work as a lawyer, where you take this whole bundle of skills and you facilitate something for a client. But in this case, I'm facilitating something for my team and our users and the company I work for. So it doesn't actually feel all that different, except it's a lot more fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to deal with like as many like pathological people. Believe it or not, I will take the R Linux comment section over a opposing party who tries to attack me in court any day.
Yeah,
any day.
That's definitely builds character, I think, when you have to sort of fight another person to try to get your point across and to sort of win that battle in court. So yeah, I think, and also if it's something that makes it more fun, it's more fun for you to work on this project. It doesn't feel like work. At least I think, if you do something that doesn't really, if it's fun, it takes that, I need to go to this place and do this and all that stuff. Since you made
that,
yeah,
good.
No, go on.
No, that was different. There was a period where like my hobby now was my job, and like what do I do now when I want to wind down? because if I go and do what I was going to do, which to wind down, which was tinker with WSL, I'm going to end up working. I'm going to end up filing a bug report. I'm going to end up doing, writing code to patch something. So that is one of the downfalls of your hobby becoming your job. So when I joined Canonical as a developer advocate. And I was a developer advocate, and I still feel like a developer advocate first in terms of my visibility in the community, the facilitation I do. But I was also kind of doing the job of the engineering manager of the team, kind of organizing the meetings, doing the clerical paperwork. So they're like, hey, we're just going to give you that title now since you're already doing it. So I definitely see I'm going to have to evolve into that role. Like I admit I'm very green in terms of being an engineering manager. Not exactly something I planned for. And I do have skills that translate, but in the long term, I may pursue some sort of additional certifications or training to kind of solidify that a little better, kind of put a bow on what I have there. But it's a long-term process. So, but yeah, it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah. I was going to ask you two things actually. So the first one is, like you said, the issue of becoming or working or turning your hobby into your job. Did you have to find a different hobby so you can spend time on, or you just fall back to the always be working all the time because it's something that you enjoy?
I paced it out. Mm-hmm. So I still will do hobby projects that involve WSL to wind down. Like you're gonna laugh, but I bought some PBX equipment on eBay that gives me basically a phone system over VoIP that I can simulate. And then I bought a handful of dial-up modems.
Okay.
Serial dial-up modems. And linked them to WSL and connected them so I could dial up out of one WSL container into another and connect them like you would old-fashioned terminal BBS. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that took about 6-8 weeks of planning and getting finding the parts and getting the parts to work and finding the old AT codes to get the modem to wake up and talk. So I still do things like that, and like I have a Rock Pro 64, which is similar to a Raspberry Pi in a lot of ways, that I hack on and use for different projects. So I still find things to do. But there was a transition where it's like, what do you do at the end of the day? And, certainly COVID changed your options.
Yeah, as well, unfortunately. Yeah, you have to spend more time at home. So, yeah. Since you did this transition, have you ever had to deal with any sort of imposter syndrome?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you have a law degree and you're a developer advocate at Canonical. And you're following in the footsteps of people like Martin Wimpress, Wimpy, and Alan Pope, who are basically Linux celebrities. And you're like, here, you now have the same title and you're on the same team as these people you've known for years as these, tech celebrities. You're going to now do the same thing just for WSL. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So, and by the way, you don't even have a computer science degree. You're a former lawyer. So yeah, that's definitely an issue, particularly when they then bumped me up to engineering manager, because again, uh, my team are smarter than I am in terms of coding, in terms of the things that they can do. And in terms of, so I recognize where my skills translate and kind of where I have some gaps to fill in. And I plan to fill in those gaps when I'm done writing my book. So the other thing is that Canonical is also provided a training program for incoming managers that help grow that talent internally. So that's very useful as well. So I'm hoping you're not picking up too much outside noise. It sounds like someone's working on their yard. Okay, good.
It's all good. That's very interesting because I believe from all the guests that I've had on the podcast, I believe the last one that I spoke to, Dr. Michaela, she has a CS degree. All the other developers that I've spoke to and software engineers, they don't have a CS degree, and everybody says the same thing. It's like, I don't have this degree. So I sort of feel a bit, it's weird to say, it's not that you are less than someone else that has a CS degree, because maybe you've learned more things or different things than someone that just finished a CS degree. And different universities, they might have maybe a delay in their curriculum, but it's still something that in our head is always like, yeah, I'm using this thing and I know how I can code, but the CS degree will give you bigger, better, get you more ready for if you have to deal with algorithms and all these technical things that when you're learning on your own, you know there's gaps in your knowledge. So yeah, it's
right.
But Kevin, so one of the guests that I had said something very interesting and said that the easiest way for us to try to quiet down that imposter syndrome is to try to think, okay, yeah, there is things I don't know, but all of these I can fill up if I have the time for it. So, yeah.
Right. I do think if you're in a position to get it, if it's something you really want to do and you're in a position to get a CS degree, go for it. Mm-hmm. If you already have degrees or a career, I think that the certification route through things like edX are a way to go to validate skills you have. And a lot of employers are more than happy to accept that. I looked at doing a CS program at some point, like a post-baccalaureate kind of master's program. But then I'm like, they wanted your, like my grades from like my undergrad. And I'm like, that was like 10 years ago. What does that have to do with anything? And they're like, well, you have to have this GPA. Well, in law school is graded on a mandatory curve. So if you are average, you get a C. You don't get the same grade inflation you get in undergrad. So not that I was a C student, I was slightly better than average, but I was not in the top of my class. So in terms of applying to a graduate program, I'm severely disadvantaged because it looks like my GPA is low, but actually compared to my classmates, I was above average. So it was a real barrier coming from a law degree to a CS degree, partly because the CS degrees, their requirements didn't really match kind of what I had to offer. So I went to edX.org, which is a massive online course platform, and basically signed up for a bunch of classes, some in areas I was already familiar with and some in areas that kind of pushed me. And took the certifications and took the exams to validate my skills. And that seems to have made a big difference. Both just having a degree, any degree, plus these certifications seems to have been close enough to a CS degree to make it. So what people are going to be capable of doing is going to depend on their academic history, the place in their career, the time that they have to either go to a boot camp or do some sort of validation certification, or even do something like a cloud certification like Azure or AWS, where basically the companies, if you figured out how to do it, they'll give you the exams and certify you for free.
Yeah.
So like if you participate at Microsoft Build or Ignite, usually there's a way to get a free certification code out of it, where then you can go save money. They'll give you the free materials, and then you can take the test for free. And now you're an Amazon certified AWS developer. So, and those are in really high demand. So there's ways to piece it together, even if you're not like me in the most ideal circumstance to get a CS degree.
I love the fact that you said that you went to edX, because that's actually I wouldn't say the first one. So the first contact that I had with code was Code Academy, but then I did the MIT 6.00X. So that's the introduction to computer science and algorithms with Python. And that was what really made me fall in love with coding, and why I wanted to maybe think that this could be a path for me in the future, because I loved how hard the course was. I loved how hard the course was. I loved spending nights just trying to think through a problem to beat it. This challenge was really interesting, and I agree. I mean, like I said, you have to fill up your gaps somehow, and if you can get these certifications, even in your head, it's a way for you to prove that you know your things and you can do the job that someone else spent 3 years and a lot of money to get that CS degree. So, yeah. Was there anything that was hard for you when you did this transition? Or was something easy to adapt because, it's something that you enjoy doing in your free time?
It was very exciting. It's a lot of fun. Initially, there was a lot of travel involved. Of course, that kind of got a damper on after travel kind of came to an end. And so Canonical is a remote first company. So 90% of the employees work from home or, go to work at a, coffee shop or that kind of thing. And then every 6 to 8 weeks, the whole company, I would say the whole company, about a third of the company gets together somewhere in the world. The places we were supposed to go this year were Santiago, Chile, Vienna, Cape Town, South Africa, and so the travel, flying 17 hours, first to Europe and then all the way down to Africa, tip of Africa, challenge is a challenge. But there was also the kind of loss of my hobby, because it's not my job. We've talked about that. And, I did have to let go of Penguin, and hand that off. I wasn't thrilled about that. But I saw kind of where I knew where Canonical wanted to go, and I knew we could do more for WSL and WSL users going over to Canonical. But all in all, I think it has been a huge net positive. So I'm really happy about the change. I'm looking forward to when we can go back to those company meetings now. I didn't think I would miss them, but I definitely do now.
We got a question as well. So hypothetically, if WSL becomes even bigger, would or will Canonical think about WSL related trainings?
Oh, WSL related trainings. So, yes. I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by trainings. Ubuntu doesn't currently have like a certification program. I think there's something in the works there, but it's not necessarily new training. It's existing skill validation. And so far, WSL specifically hasn't come up. What we do have is WSLconf, which is our conference dedicated to WSL. And we have presenters come from and give presentations on everything from like getting started to kind of more advanced topics. So we have a whole library now, I think of about 30 videos on various things you can do on WSL on the Ubuntu YouTube page. I've got my blogs. We also have the wiki. The Ubuntu wiki has an entry for WSL, and I put some tutorials there. We certainly could do more. We know that. So I think I would be more interested in having whoever asked that question get in touch with me and tell them what they wanted to see, because that will shape what we do. Right now, we have a big push to help. So we have a lot of users, developers who are at work on Windows PCs who are using WSL, and they're either not supposed to be using WSL, or their company just blocks them from using WSL because their Windows devices are locked down or some other issue. So we are right now researching kind of what those barriers are as well, and figuring out how we can empower employees to go to the decision makers in their organizations and kind of say, hey, let's do Ubuntu on WSL. This is why it makes such difference in my workflow. By the way, if we have problems, we can call Canonical. Canonical will provide support. So I'd be interested in hearing what kind of training users would be interested in having or doing, and also hearing kind of what barriers people are encountering in their workplace with WSL. Because we have a lot of developers who have it on their personal machines and want to take it to work, and we've got to bridge the gap there for workplaces.
The one thing that I've noticed personally with WSL that would make me want to use a proper Unix machine, so a proper Linux machine, would be in Python when you deal with async. You have the async loop, and Windows uses a different kind of loop to manage their async thing. So this was actually a very big thing that we had to try to support on this open source project. And I was picking up a very old connector for Twitter that uses a async loop, and it doesn't work because it's using the Windows async loop instead of the Ubuntu. Which, to be honest, I haven't spent enough time digging into that to figure out if I can change something. But yeah, that was the only thing that I was a bit like, okay, that's interesting. I would expect it to use the whole Ubuntu workings, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, were you on WSL 1 or WSL 2?
I'm on WSL 2.
Okay. There are some like edge cases, and a lot of them tend to be either networking or file system related with iNotify because of quirks of trying to access NTFS from the virtual Linux environment. and sometimes those signals don't get passed correctly. But the good news is that the WSL team at Microsoft is super responsive, and things like that crop up. Good news is things like that have gotten a lot better with WSL2. Having the full virtualized Linux kernel there has solved so many problems. It's introduced a couple more, but a lot of those really obscure things kind of went away with WSL2. We used to have an issue with RPM, the package manager, on CentOS and Fedora and RHEL on WSL1, and it had bugged people with WSL for years. We finally figured out the issue. It was an obscure system call compatibility issue, but it just doesn't exist on WSL2. Like you don't have to worry about those obscure system calls. Yeah. So if people have tried WSL1 and been disappointed, I strongly encourage them to get and try WSL2 again, because a lot of those issues have been resolved.
WSL Corsair, I believe you know who it is.
Yeah.
He said that a good training would be to learn Ubuntu Linux on WSL, and then how to move to a full-fledged environment, VM or bare metal. It's actually a very good idea, and a very good idea for maybe a blog post or a video on YouTube or something. So, yeah.
Well, the funny thing is that Nuno is the tech reviewer on my book on advanced WSL. So maybe we should put it maybe he should write it and we should put it in the book.
I think that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. I actually think that's interesting, how to transition from WSL to either a VM in Hyper-V, or a VM in the cloud. And see, that's the difference that Ubuntu provides. So we're at Penguin, we provided like a really bespoke WSL specific experience. Like this is, tuned specifically for WSL. With Ubuntu, we don't provide as much WSL customization out of the box. We still provide some WSL related utilities. But the idea there is that when you develop on WSL, on Ubuntu on WSL, it's going to have the same core base packages as Ubuntu Server. It's going to be very similar to what deploying to the cloud is going to look like. In fact, we're working on a new out-of-box experience right now that uses the same libraries as the server installer. So if you are comfortable running Ubuntu from the store, installing Ubuntu from the store and running it and seeing the interface for the first time and going through that interface, when you're ready to move to Ubuntu Server and you set that up for the first time, it's going to be incredibly familiar. It's just you're going to be like, oh, I've seen this before. So there's certainly more we could do there. I think that's a good idea,
So why did you decide to write a book? Was it because you were answering the same sort of questions all the time, or?
Mostly it was flattery that someone thought I could write a book. No. So there were no WSL books at the time. And there have been a couple introductory WSL books, but there hasn't been a book yet that like delves into the theoretical architecture, and advanced things you can do with WSL, like nested virtualization and using KVM to install other operating systems within WSL, using Kubernetes and that kind of thing. So the key, and the key to anyone who I think wants to move into tech is to find an emerging niche area. and get really good at that and start writing and talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is, and that it doesn't even have to be new. So like the Kubernetes is definitely on the rise, and there's a lot of talk there, and there may still be room there, but there's already a lot of people doing work there. So you might want to look. I mean, it could be something even obscure as like learning Fortran on modern IBM mainframes. There's still a market there. There's still a niche there, and there's not a lot of people doing it. And it can be easy to distinguish yourself in that space with a blog, with YouTube tutorials, with getting out there. And then once you get out there, you will get noticed. And, the opportunities start to trickle up from there.
Yeah.
So, getting involved in as a maintainer is another idea, something that you've done. That certainly, if you're looking for a job at like an open source company like Canonical, having open source contributions in the community is important as well. But find your niche and then start talking about it, and you'd be really surprised where you can go with this. Especially, you don't even have to be that good, because I'm not that good, right? I'm just able to get. I'm just able to. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. But just being able to get out there and talk about it, you can really accelerate your career.
Mm-hmm. Because you had all this experience creating Penguin, moved to Canonical, work on the Ubuntu WSL, and you also do the WSLconf. I think if someone should write a book about this, I think it's you, really. Do you have any provision
I appreciate
when the book will come out?
I think the current target is middle of 2021 now. So we're going through the final chapters now. I just realized the actual manuscript is due in 10 days, which I'm totally not going to make. But we'll get there close.
Hopefully you work well under pressure.
Yeah. 2020 is a different level of pressure, though. So everyone needs to make sure they're also attending to self-care and, their emotional needs. That's important.
Yeah. And Nuno said, not the fault of the reviewer, hopefully.
No, it's not his fault. So are you still flying from time to time?
Yeah, I actually went back to flying in July. So we sat down at home for 3 months. And July was a weird month because the whole airport was running at like 5%. Every shop was closed. The lights were dimmed. It was really weird. We even started thinking like, should I actually be in here? Now the flights are still, they're not full. Some flights to Turkey, because from UK, Turkey was on the green list. So in UK, I'm not sure if you know how it goes, but in UK you have a list where if countries have a lot of cases, they go to the red list, and then you have to self-isolate if you come back to UK. So Turkish flights, they were very busy. Now Turkey is on the list, so they are less busy. We are getting back into this weird time where flights are coming up empty. I believe we are running around 30% capacity or 40% capacity, but don't quote me on that. We're definitely running less flights. And then November is always a slow month for aviation. at least in Europe. And I think, I'm not sure if we will be flying much, since all cases around Europe are rising. So we'll see how it goes. But we are back to flying, so that's good. Actually, last month I was very, very busy, which I didn't expect. So I was like, wow, okay, this is good. Go back to work. So we'll see how it goes. Just to finish this off. Sorry, go on.
Oh, you're fine. No, the airport. The description sounds like the airport's at like 3 a.m. When they're all closed.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you're there, it's 9 a.m. and it's supposed to be packed.
Yeah, and it's not, and you see maybe a couple of people, and you're like, okay. Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to rush you. I just say that I want to try to keep it 1 hour and respect your time. That's the only reason why I said that.
Sure.
If folks want to share with you some ideas for WSL training or anything about WSL, if they have questions, if they want to see what you are doing, anything really, how or where is the best place to do
that? 2 places, at Unix Terminal, that's UNIXTERMINAL, on Twitter. You can either reply or DM me. Also my blog, boxofcables.dev. And I try to post there more often, probably lately because I've been doing so much other writing. It's been about once a month, but add it to your RSS reader. I tend to post interesting stuff there. I had just a random blog post I posted over the weekend that kind of went a little viral.
That's good.
So you never know.
I love your Twitter handle and your website name, and I'm quite surprised that your Twitter handle was available.
Me too, and that's why I hung on to it as hard as I can.
that's a good idea. So thank you for taking the time to spend this hour chatting about your journey. It's definitely very interesting, and I'm looking forward to read your book and to get your book. So I will keep an eye on to see when it's finally released. Because, like I said, I started with WSL, and I think it will be something cool to dig deep. And since you are going into the whole, then you can escalate this into more advanced stuff. I think it will be very interesting to read about. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate this series, this podcast, because I think it's an important area of tech that we should talk about more. Switchers. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And actually, you were the one that agreed to come on the podcast when we had this very brief chat on Twitter. I think it was on one of the tweets that I said about the WSL, and you commented out, and then you said, "Oh yeah, actually, I went from lawyer to be this engineering manager." So I was like, "Oh, that's great. I'd love to hear about it." So I also appreciate you taking the time to agree to be on the podcast and to chat. I hope you have a good day, and see you later.
You too. Thank you.